Hello, my name's Stephen Robinson. I'm the National Disaster Recovery Officer for the Uniting Church, working from the Assembly. My role extends across New South Wales in particular, where I oversee the Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network for New South Wales, but also into every other state and territory in Australia in terms of assisting in the preparation for, the planning for, the learning from, and the response to disasters. And I also work at the Uniting World quite a bit into the Pacific, into our partnerships with our churches, or partner churches out there. And as such, I think I've been working in this area for around about 20 years, 6 years now full-time in disaster recovery, about 20 years connected with disaster response in New South Wales. Each state and territory has its own arrangements for recovery and for welfare, and that includes plans that are very well worked out at both state and district and local level. In nearly every state, that includes some level of pastoral care that's provided through networks that I connect with. And as of the last couple of years, there's been AVECA, which is Australian Volunteer Emergency Chaplaincy Alliance, that operates as a network under the National Council of Churches in Australia. I'm the secretary for that body. It's easier to climate impact conference like this one to spend a lot of time on raw statistics and on graphs relating to climate change. And it is important to actually work with good data and to be aware of that. And I will be bringing some of that myself tonight. But what I want to do particularly is to spend time looking at what human element is engaged in and affected by weather-related disasters that's driven by climate change. What does it look like on the ground? When there's a flood or a windstorm or some other event that threatens lives and people and they're given an evacuation order, in New South Wales, the Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network chaplains are deployed, and they work alongside other agencies, including Red Cross, Anglicare, and the Salvation Army. Each of those partners have a designated role, feeding people, clothing them, being able to assist with their move to shelter. Each of them have a part in the plan. Our role of chaplaincy is to listen to people, to engage with them, to bring a sense of comfort and calm and bring immediate support, as well as to offer spiritual support and pastoral care. In that listening, we get to hear a lot of stories. We get to see a lot of different lives in times of great stress, to hear what the issues are for people. And that makes the chaplains particularly helpful in terms of being able to feed back general needs and where things are not working and where the needs might be through disaster welfare into the system. I've been working in the emergency ministry space for about 25 years now, the last 10 years coordinating the Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network full-time, and in the national and international disaster pastoral care space. And that's given me a fairly broad overview of what's going on. And what I have found consistently is whether it's fire or flood or cyclone or earthquake or volcano or landslip or even disease, it's always the poorest people who are most affected by natural disaster. Where do the people who are struggling financially live? Well, they live in the areas that are most likely to be affected, the low-lying ground, for instance. Rich people live on the hills with all the views and they're in safe places, relatively safe. But people who are poor or people who are struggling or people who are just trying to get by on little live in low-lying ground. That includes places like caravan parks or the built-in ground floors of houses in flood-prone areas. They're the ones who come into an evacuation centre having lost everything, and perhaps having lost everything at least more than once before. Reality is that people who are impacted in this way have usually done it tough in other ways. The people evacuated from lower socioeconomic circumstances quite often have already been through a situation of loss, perhaps even domestic violence or abuse, and they're just trying to get by. Over and over, it's those who are living rough, people who are living in shipping containers on bush blocks or in tents or in cheap and vulnerable rental accommodation. They're already doing it tough when disasters hit. So when we're talking about disasters and the impact that comes through climate-driven natural events, we recognise that those are the ones who are most heavily affected. Another thing I've seen throughout my time in disaster response and recovery ministry is a growing complexity in disaster events and a growing frequency and intensity in the disaster events. And I'd like to share some of my observations with you, in particular about last summer's disaster season and the way it's impacted people. I think you'd have to be living on another planet not to know that last summer's fires were unprecedented. Though we've had fire campaigns in the past, like the Victorian Black Saturday fires of 2009, which were horrific in themselves, or large-scale losses in 2001 or 2013 in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, this season burned more ground over a longer period of time than any other fire emergency in Australia's history. And just the raw figures are extraordinary. They're bad enough. I've just been reading the Resilience New South Wales report on fire recovery, which was released only a few days ago, and the official figures on the fire season were staggering. 11,558 fires, 26 lives lost in New South Wales, 2,476 houses destroyed, 157 hospitals and ambulances affected, numbers of livestock in 13,729 deceased livestock, and it goes on. 88,832 kilometres of fencing destroyed. And the staggering number in terms of the land that was affected, 5.5 million hectares burned, 2.6 million hectares of national park burned. And when you think about just that area, the scale and all that was within that, that's quite frightening, very sobering. We can look at those statistics and we can think that that's the whole story, but it actually isn't. The personal impact is much, much greater. And to understand that, we need to acknowledge a phenomenon called compound extremes. A compound extreme is defined as the simultaneous or sequential occurrence of multiple extremes at singular or multiple locations. Compound extremes have the capacity to make the impact of a related extreme event worse when compared to the impact of each event by itself in isolation. This means that, for instance, extreme fire events are bad enough, but if you combine them with prolonged drought, then heat wave, then a fire emergency, and then on top of that extreme rain or flooding, you've got a dreadful combination. A further example about is a more singular compound extreme is the ferocity of the fires in last season is that they were so ferocious that in some cases they generated their own weather fronts. There were fires in the last season which generated thunderstorms, which in turn set more fires ahead of the front. They're known as pyrocumulonimbus or pyro-CBs. It was a phenomenon that really only came to notice in the Black Saturday fires in Victoria some years ago, where they started sparking fires 100 kilometres ahead of the fire front. And what was a newly discovered phenomenon then seems to be becoming more and more common. In the last season, the Gospers fire in November in the Blue Mountains was one of these. And not only they bring violent electrical activity, they also bring with them extreme winds as well, which makes fighting the fire particularly dangerous and difficult. But getting back to the human element within the last fire season, we, the Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network, had our first call for chaplains to attend an evacuation centre on September 6th last year. And that was in relation to the fires that were breaking out near Tenterfield in the state's north, which prompted evacuations in the area. The area had already been subjected to drought for a long time before that, for some years before that. Some owners that the chaplain spoke to said that they had spent all their money on stock, on being able to keep them alive, essentially. All their savings were taken, their loans were extended to try and keep their stock alive, and they were nearly finished emotionally, financially, in terms of any sort of business or economically when the fires hit. They were already right on the edge because of the prolonged drought. Not only did that bring with it sheep and cattle being burned and hundreds of them, of that stock having to be shot and buried in mass graves, mass burial pits. But even with stock that was saved from the fire, the little amount of feed that was left in terms of pasture for them was quite often burned out by fire or was lost through backburning by the fire services to try and save other properties. Dams, which were getting very low from the prolonged drought and the lack of rainfall for some time before that, they were being drained by firefighting aircraft that were coming down, dipping buckets in to be able to fight the fire. For many of the farmers that we spent time with, the loss of fencing through fire is a major factor. The statistics on that from the report that was just released was talking about 88,832 kilometres of boundary fencing. That's the stuff on the outside of properties. Now that might seem like just a number until you talk to a farmer in the far north who's worried about trying to keep his stock safe from wandering onto roads or moving off to be lost in bush or burning crown land or national parks. For some of those farmers, that was a major stressor, having to try to replace fencing, which is extremely expensive and time-consuming. Thankfully, there are groups like Blaze Aid that have volunteers going out, but even they are still out in the field trying to deal with losses of fencing from last summer. Many of the people that our chaplains attended to in this area had little in the way of reserves. Many had been living on small bush blocks out of the way in small shacks or caravans or even in shipping containers. And they had very little in the way of possessions with them and some level of suspicion of government agencies. And for them who'd lost those homes, these fires were the last straw. One of the things I've observed in the last 20 years has been the nature of the fire seasons themselves. I was training chaplains in disaster response in Queensland during November last year, and they were telling me that the people that they were attending to were in shock. They were being evacuated from areas that had never burned in living memory. Areas of rainforest in the hinterland. For myself, in New South Wales, I personally attended the home of what was left of it, of a person on a bush block who had worked for nearly 30 years to research and regenerate native rainforest, who had his entire property, including a house, caravan and native nursery, destroyed by fire. And we're talking about rainforest burning. To me, it brings home that weather patterns are changing, and the trend is that fire is happening further north than before. Cyclonic activity is happening further south. East coast lows are now more prevalent and more threatening as well as part of that mix of the tropical weather coming further south. A contributing factor to this is that the fire seasons are coming on earlier and earlier each year. In the first days of the Royal Commission into Bushfires, which is running at the moment, Carl Braganza, head of the Bureau of Meteorology's climate monitoring, told the Commission that the south coast of New South Wales and eastern Victoria now sees fire weather arriving 3 months earlier than it did in the 1950s. 3 months earlier than it did in the 1950s. This means that this trend to longer and longer seasons and shorter sense of respite from them means that communities have less time to recover from the previous fire season and less time to prepare for the new one. It's a smaller window of hazard reduction burning, and it's also an issue as communities can be hit by disastrous fire events sooner. From the fires in the north of the state, that was towards the end of last year, from September through to November, then at the very end of the year and into the new year, the mid-north coast was badly hit. And then about the new year, the south coast areas and areas across to the Victorian border and into into the snowy were being hit by fire. And one of the events that was very concerning was within the last season was the Bega Valley, including Tathra. In March 2018, the little town of Tathra had 69 houses destroyed and 39 houses damaged, along with 30 caravans and cabins. People had to flee to survive. Some had waited on beaches and the majority fled to an evacuation centre at the Bega Showground. This was back in March 2018. Then again at the beginning of this year, 2020, that township was reliving the horror of the whole thing over and over again as this town was once again threatened, and again evacuation took place to the Bega Showground. You can only imagine how hard it was for a community which was still in the early stages of recovery, essentially, to once again be hit by evacuations, fire in the night, and smoke. At one point, there was nearly an evacuation of the evacuation centre at Bega due to the levels of smoke that was threatening to overcome people with breathing difficulties. They were thinking very seriously about moving everybody from there to somewhere that might be safer. If you think about smoke, I have to say that a number of times I was really greatly concerned about the well-being of our chaplains who were in those environments as they ministered to people being evacuated, breathing the stuff, which is dangerous. I'm sure if you cast your mind back to the fire season, you'll remember the smoke yourself. The fires covering much of New South Wales, ACT, Victoria, South Australia and Queensland generated an extraordinary amount of smoke. All the east coast was living under the pall of it, and it was so extensive that satellite mapping showed smoke circling the globe. It was only after the fires that the human impact of the smoke was discovered. I attended the state memorial service for bushfire victims at the Kudos Arena earlier this year, and it rightly acknowledged the tragic deaths of 26 bushfire victims in New South Wales. 26 people and their families and their communities is a tragic and awful thing. But we haven't really begun to count the real numbers of people who died as a result of the fires. In a submission to the Royal Commission, Associate Professor Faye Johnson, who's an environmental health expert from the University of Tasmania, reported on a study which had overlaid hospital admissions with air quality data over the last season. She stated that the 2019-20 bushfires had killed 445 people from smoke-related illnesses. Small smoke particles triggering immune responses from people who had pre-existing illnesses such as heart diseases or breathing difficulty, combining with distress. The study found that 3,340 extra admissions to hospitals for heart and lung issues had occurred, and more than 1,000 admissions to hospitals for asthma. Smoke-related health costs from that season were estimated to be around $2 billion. It's easy to miss the lower the impacts which are out of sight, and smoke impact was one very big one, which is becoming more and more part of the fire seasons in this country. There's another hidden killer in the last season. I don't know if you're aware that the disaster which takes more life than any other in Australia, in fact across the world, is not fire, though it can combine with it, it's heat wave. Heat waves kill more people than all the other natural disasters combined. Globally, according to the World Health Organization, extreme temperature events are observed to be increasing in their frequency, their duration, and their magnitude. Between 2000 and 2016, the number of people exposed to heat waves increased by around 125 million. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of heat and places. Since 1950, the annual number of record hot days across Australia has more than doubled, according to the CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology. And the mean temperatures increased by about 0.9 of a degree. Over the past decade, the frequency of record hot days has been more than 3 times the frequency of record cold days. I remember throughout the fires of last summer, I was watching the weather, and night after night there were reports of record temperatures and a number of times that heat waves of bringing day after day of sustained record temperatures were reported. As the fires burned across the mid-north coast of New South Wales and into the south coast, I talked to chaplains out in the field, and they were reporting in from where they were with people. When people evacuate, they evacuate with their horses, they evacuate with their household pets. And most of the evacuation centres that they go to are clubs like RSL clubs, sporting clubs. And during the fire emergency, they went out of their way, the chaplains, to care for these pets. But some had to be left outside due to their size or the nature of them. There is an animals and agriculture functional area which had people working, vets and people from the Department of Ag, working extremely hard to care for people's animals during the fire season. But the extremes of heat, well over 40 degrees on quite a lot of days, had chaplains going out to take care of their dogs and cats and dogs in particular, just to assure elderly owners that they were okay and to save some of those people from extreme heat exposure. I mentioned that the fire seasons are getting longer. Last season was the ultimate example of this. It came with sustained stress. Chaplains reported whole communities living on edge. And with that came the reality that many communities were actually evacuated multiple times or standing on edge, waiting with a watch and act alert from the fire authorities, not knowing whether they were safe or not. The heat, the smoke, the pervading sense of fear is not conducive to good mental health. And we could see that in many cases, people were beginning to become quite deeply disturbed by what they were going through. Our chaplains themselves are well trained, they're self-aware, they're self-disciplined. They began to become quite fatigued. In fact, nearly everyone that I spoke to in the disaster welfare space, which was beyond us, into all the partners that were working in there, were exhausted by the unrelenting heaviness of carrying out responsibility without being able to stop. Normally, when we have a disaster response, like an evacuation, we can work with an evacuation centre for a week or two, and then work with recovery within a town for maybe a month or so, and then we can stand down. Last season, we had none of that. We had fires burning for 6 months, one place or the other across the state, sometimes and often multiple places. Then flooding, and then before we had a chance to settle in the locals or to begin process of community recovery, COVID-19 hit, sent everybody home into lockdown. I'm really deeply concerned for the people who've been affected by the fire season this year, who've been isolated so heavily by the virus, just when they most needed to be supported by people around them and connection with their community and their neighbours. They have to be isolated. It's very tough. Thinking of cyclones, a change from fires. I mentioned that the flooding that happened at the end of the fire season, global changes in weather have brought a number of impacts which I've seen causing loss and evacuations here in Australia and the Pacific. Though the number of named cyclones in Australian waters has decreased since 1960s, we are seeing far more severe storm activity getting further and further south. The number of storms with winds stronger than 250 kilometres an hour have tripled since 1980. So the storms are getting further south and they're getting faster, more destructive. And another trend which is really worrying for the north of Australia is the slowing of translation speed of tropical cyclones by 10% from 1949 to 2016 when this study was done. The translation speed of a cyclone is not the pace of how fast it spins and the wind speed, it's about how slowly it moves across the land. And the danger of a slower translation speed for cyclones is that the slower it moves through, the more rain it dumps, the more damage it does, and the greater the risk of flash flooding. Alongside these comes also the impact of, which is related to this, which is East Coast lows. I mentioned that the tropical cyclones frequency has decreased since the 60s, but the rise in storm activity further south has increased markedly, as in East Coast lows. Those things bring protracted flooding to the, particularly to the high density areas along the east coast of Queensland and New South Wales. In 2017, the towns from the Gold Coast through the far north coast were slammed by the tail of Cyclone Debbie, which dumped an extraordinary amount of rain along that area from Lismore, Kyogle, Murwillumbah, Tumbulgum and the Tweed. That whole area, without touching the drought further inland. The central business district of Lismore was devastated by this event in 2017. Our chaplains worked in that area for over a year, and much of the township have not recovered even now. They're still suffering from that time and that extraordinary flooding of the CBD. After all that our chaplains went through in supporting them, and they were the ones who did hundreds of hours taking care this season, at the end of last year, taking care of fire evacuees to the west, gathered in showgrounds with their horses and with their pets right through this. And this is where we're starting to think about compound extremes. I started this session talking about the fire season, beginning in the first week of spring last year, fires which burned right through till March this year from one end of the state to the other. Talking about compound extremes, the end of the fire season came with rain, heavy, extensive rain. As much as we had prayed for it, we didn't want to see so much of it in so concentrated in areas. We had chaplains in a number of evacuation centres on the Central Coast, which had been previously opened just before that for fire evacuees, were now flood affected. One extreme example, one instance at Ulladulla at the Civic Centre, which had been an evacuation centre for people fleeing the fires weeks earlier and had transitioned into a recovery centre for fires. One floor was a recovery centre for them, and the other floor was an evacuation centre for people forced from their homes by flash flooding. I don't claim to be a climate scientist, but I've got to say that in the time I've spent in terms of disaster response, we're seeing high levels of very complex, compounding weather events which are extreme. And we're seeing things happen that have never happened before. As we spend time in this conference, my thought is not to cause more alarm or more concern, but to simply name what's going on, so that minds greater than mine and perhaps people that are able to give a voice might be able to lend what's needed to see a change in what is driving this weather, in the human behaviours which are fostering that and causing us in so many ways a lot more stress than what I would want to hope for the future generations. I commend to you the rest of the conference and pray that in whatever happens from this, it will be something of healing and help along the way. Thank you for listening.